Welcome to the Businesstalk podcast. I am your host Deepak from India. We are honored to welcome Dr. Pablo Buchkowski and Dr. Mora Matasi as our distinguished guests on today's podcast episode. Before we begin the conversation, let me take a moment to introduce our guest for today's episode. Dr. Pablo Buchkowski is a Hamad bin Khalifa Al Thani professor in the Department of Communication Studies at Northwestern University. He is the founder and director of the Center for Latinx Digital Media and faculty director of the Master of Science in Leadership for Creative Enterprises at Northwestern University. He also co-directs a joint MSLCE program between Northwestern and University of San Andreas. A fellow and past chair of the International Communication Association, his research explores the dynamics of digital culture from a comparative perspective. He has authored 6 books, 4 edited volumes, and over 60 journal articles. Our second guest for this episode is Dr. Mora Matasi. Dr. Mora Matasi holds a PhD in Media, Technology, and Society from Northwestern University, a master's degree in Technology, Innovation, and Education from Harvard University, and bachelor's degree in Communication from University of San Andreas. She is currently an adjunct professor in the Department of Social Sciences at University of San Andreas. Her research focuses on the intersection of technology, communication, and digital culture, exploring how people adopt digital platforms in their everyday lives, dynamics of voluntary digital disconnection, and their relationship with contemporary sociability and subjectivity. She has received support and recognition from institutions such as the Fulbright Commission, Harvard Graduate School of Education, and the government of the province of Buenos Aires, among others. Her work has been published in international journals such as News Media and Society, Journal of Computer Mediated Communication, and Social Media and Society. In this episode, both guests discuss their book, To Know is to Compare, Studying Social Media Across Nations, Media, and Platforms, and show how systematic comparative research can unlock the potential of social media scholarship. Listeners, the book received the 2024 Global Communication and Social Change Book Award from the International Communication Association. It is our great pleasure to now invite our guests to the conversation. Professor Pablo and Dr. Mora, we are truly honored that you have accepted our invitation and delighted to have you with us today.
Thank you very much for your invitation, Deepak. It is a great honor to be here.
Yes, thank you so much, Deepak. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Dr. Mora and Dr. Pablo, your book is built on the epistemological principle that everything we know emerges from comparing 2 or more entities. Can you explain how this foundational idea shaped your framework for studying social media and why comparison is so essential to generating meaningful knowledge in this field?
Yes, I am happy to start replying your question. For us, the idea of to know is to compare is not just a metaphor. It's actually a sort of epistemological claim. That is, it regards how knowledge is created. And what we want to communicate in the book is that knowledge does not emerge from studying isolated objects, but it emerges from thinking relationally and comparing between objects. And we claim this because we understand that you only really understand and explain phenomena when you put it next to something else, when you put 2 items next to each other and you start observing very simple aspects that are really deep too, like similarity, difference, continuity, discontinuity. And that insight really shaped the entire framework of the book. We were looking at social media, of course, as you already presented in your introduction. And what we do is that we claim that instead of treating social media as a sort of self-contained object, we need to build analysis of social media around comparison in 3 dimensions, across nations, across media, and across platforms, because that's actually how social media themselves actually operate, and not only for their own operation, but actually for people's perspectives and everyday uses. Platforms circulate globally. They coexist with older media rather than replacing them. And platforms evolve in constant relation to one another through many times imitation, sometimes divergence, competition. And so just to end this first question, Deepak, I think that comparison is essential because it makes heterogeneity visible, right? And this is one of the claims of the last chapters, that we want to bring forward the heterogeneity of social media, and also to distinguish what is contingent from what is actually recurrent, what is historically specific from what travels across a context. And we think that with comparison is where we can achieve those goals.
Yes, Professor Pablo.
Yes, just I don't have much to add to what Mora said, but to illustrate a little bit the genesis of the project, which started in Buenos Aires, where actually both of us are at the moment, close to 10 years ago. We reflected in a conversation at the coffee shop, actually adjacent to Google's offices in Buenos Aires. We reflected that the vast majority of the scholarship at the time, and still today, tended to look at social media in isolation from all other media, looking at one platform at a time, and usually its use is within one country. What do I mean? So polarization on Twitter in the 2016 US election. So there you have one medium, social media, without any comparison or taking into account even cable television, etc. One platform, Twitter, without considering how polarization might occur in Twitter or Facebook or Instagram in comparison, and only one country. The US, and the vast majority of the scholarship operated like that. So that was the impetus for this book. And over time, we developed this framework that Mora explained so well, that is captured in the book title, that the only way to know is really to compare.
Dr. Mora, you argue that social media scholarship too often focuses on single platforms in single countries, disconnected from other media. What are the key limitations of this siloed approach, and what insights do researchers miss when they fail to adopt a comparative lens?
Yes, that's a very interesting question, and a very important one that we try to tackle across the different chapters of the book. I would say that we are generally dealing with a sort of three-way silo in social media research thus far. People tend to study single platforms in single countries, often from the global north, and they tend to treat social media, as Pablo was saying, as isolated from other media, either new media or legacy media. And sort of the book's point, in part, is trying to show what are the limitations of doing that, and on the contrary, what are the gains that you have when you don't do that. So let's start with sort of a single country bias, right? If you study a single country, and as I said, the majority of research thus far has been really focused on countries from the global north, namely the US, you end up assuming that what you observe in one national context travels as a baseline, right? But what empirical research shows is that platform practices and meanings are shaped by national institutions, histories, regulation, media systems, histories of inequalities. And without a cross-national comparison, you just can't demonstrate when is it that the nation state matters, when is it that globalization matters for shaping the particular thing that you want to study. Then if you look at the sort of single medium silo, studying platforms as if they emerged into a vacuum tends to erase the genealogy and the history of platforms and the way in which they coexist and shape each other, right? So social media, and we show this in the book with various examples, from reality TV shows to political streams that are, hyped right now. Social media borrows genres, aesthetics, formats from older media, like legacy media. And they circulate content many times that originates there, and they are built into intermedia agenda dynamics, right? And so what we do in the cross-media chapter specifically is that we show all the ways in which, in order to really understand how social media works, you need to understand how it works in tandem with how television, journalism, movie theaters work, even tabloids, magazines. And finally, and to conclude, and this can already be assumed from everything that I'm saying, if you look at a single platform at a time, you often forget how platforms, social media platforms, historically have engaged in processes of imitation, differentiation, and that the way that people use them is highly multi-platform and relation. That is, people use various platforms, they build their own social media ecosystems, and these ecosystems are, as the word implies, systems. So every part of it really depends on the rest of the platforms that are there. So the way that you relate to Instagram is associated to the way in which you relate to X, say, if you only use X and Instagram. So again, all these ways show you that having a siloed approach misses actually the comparative payoff and how you can understand what holds across contexts, what varies, and specifically why.
Professor, in chapter on cross-national comparisons, you discuss how platform practices sometimes present major commonalities across different national contexts, while at other times they vary significantly. And Dr. Mora, can you share examples that illustrate this tension and what these variations reveal about the role of national culture in shaping social media use?
Pablo?
So I thought the question was addressed to you. Sorry, that's why I got my microphone muted. Deepak, who would you like from us to answer?
Yeah, Professor, if you could just give us some flavor,
Sure.
and then Dr. Mora
Sure.
can share some example on this tension.
Sure. So historically, national media systems were quite distinct because they were shaped by the difficulties that, say, for instance, newspapers or magazines had to go from one country to the next, right? Same with open air television, with broadcast television, same with AM or FM radio. As a result, while there was some exchange of practices from business executives and media leaders from one country to the next, they were largely shaped by national regulations, cultures, and histories. Social media, in particular, of all the different digital media forms, are the ones that cross barriers across nations with the greatest ease. Right, so it's in terms from the user vantage point, in terms of the users accessing content, myself in Buenos Aires, that now is originating in India versus originating in the US, it requires the same amount of effort and it costs me the same amount of time, essentially. So of all different media forms, historically, social media is the one that crosses national borders the most and with the greatest ease. So having said that, if technology was the only determinant of how we use media, we would expect that users worldwide use media in social media in the same ways. But what the research shows is that there are still significant differences, right, in terms of patterns of use across nations, which is why it is important to not take for granted, right, the role of the national context in driving how people use different social media platforms. That doesn't mean that it is always different, right? But it means that whether people say in India or the US or in Argentina use X in similar or different ways needs to be explained rather than to be assumed. So that is the main rationale historically and technologically why we focus on the national context. And I let Mora to provide some illustrations now.
Yes, thank you, Pablo, and thank you, Deepak. We developed two cases actually trying to show how there is variation across nations and across cultures in terms of the impacts per se that social media can have on different dependent variables. So what we do is that we compare between the global circulation of feminist protests based on a Chilean case that I will just present. And we also, we compare that case to another case regarding the global spread of anti-racist mobilizations in the global north versus in the global south. So What we do is that we show how similar protests travel globally in different ways through social media. So to start, let me tell you a little bit about a case that we work with, which is the case of feminist performance called in Spanish, Un violador en tu camino, a rapist in your path, which was created by a feminist collective called Las Tesis from Chile, and which basically tried to produce a feminist message regarding machista violence, regarding the state violence. And this started in a very tiny space in the streets of Chile, but rapidly became viral and spread across dozens of countries, languages, social media platforms, and it really became a global anthem vectored by social media, basically. And it became global through social media. And then we had another case, which was the mobilization that was created around anti-racist mobilizations in Brazil, when woman from Brazil, Marielle Franco, was assassinated. And we showed the contrast between how anti-racist mobilizations in Brazil spread against what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement in 2020 in the US, which had a massive global resonance. And so what we do is that by looking at these cases comparatively, where these protests in Brazil really traveled specifically in Latin America and not globally, versus the case of the feminist anthem, which really came from Latin America but spread all across the world. This shows us how global platforms don't produce uniform outcomes, right? We need to consider histories of race, gender, policing, media systems, cultures, and all of these shape how visibility, solidarity, even political action unfolds locally and globally.
Yeah. Dr. Mora, your framework emphasizes placing social media in relation to other media rather than studying it in isolation. How does the cross-media approach linking television, newspaper, radio, and social media enrich our understanding of how people actually consume and interact with information today?
Yes, and actually, this is one of my favorite chapters of the book, and I really love the examples that come from thinking in terms of cross-media lenses. What we do, trying to talk about the cross-media lens to study social media, is that, as I said before, we start with a very simple idea, which is social media did not emerge into a media vacuum, and they entered an ecosystem already shaped by legacy media, made by media like television, print journalism, radio, movies, tabloids, magazines. They absorbed and transformed many of their logics, and not just historically, but today, when social media are consumed by people, they are consumed in relation to the traditional media that people consume. Actually, one of the first papers that we wrote with Pablo and with another colleague of us, Professor Eugenia Milchestein, dealt with what we call the incidental consumption of news on social media. And that basically tried to tackle a phenomenon that we were observing in in-depth interviews with users from Argentina, that consisted on basically finding news casually, randomly, on social media that came from traditional media and their accounts on social media platforms, right? We would hear many people talking about how they would use, say, Instagram for information consumption because they knew that legacy media was present on social media, right? And that's just one example of how, in the present, people shape their social media use in relation to traditional media and vice versa. But also, you can take that historically, right? And one of the examples that we work with and that I really think it's interesting is the case of reality television. Now, reality television emerged in the late, in the 90s, and was especially popular in the early 2000s. Take the case of Keeping Up with the Kardashians, the television show. And, it was seen as something very novel, as something very special, because it consisted on putting a camera 24/7 to people's everyday life. and just showing the ordinary, right? Not the extraordinary, but the ordinary of everyday life. And years later, we hear all these conversations about how social media is basically about putting a camera 24/7, showing how people do ordinary things. And so if you start seeing the continuities between, okay, this genre, this format, reality television, and the cultures of social media, platforms like TikTok or Instagram, you start to see continuities, historical continuities, and you start seeing how, the issue of narcissism or of this heightened mediatized subjectivity that social media call for had already started years ago with legacy media like television, right? So what we do with the cross-media approach is that we trace genealogies and we trace co-presence of media and how in that co-presence media shape each other.
Dr. Pablo, with the rise of platforms like TikTok, Instagram, X, and WhatsApp, how can researchers meaningfully compare user behavior and content dynamics across these very different platforms? And what methodological challenges arise when conducting cross-platform research?
That's an excellent question. I think a lot of the research on digital use, digital consumption, and all things related to how people appropriate these different tools that now are ubiquitous in our lives, from the cell phone to social media platforms to now AI chatbots, is fascinated with the capabilities of the technology and starts there instead of starting with the humans, that is us, that are using them. So the main challenge methodologically is actually the simplest one, which is that we need not forget that what comes first is the people, not the tool. So if we focus first on the people, then we can start asking questions that are relevant to them, that is to us as users, and figure out what is new and what is not with regards to how we interact with different technologies. Technologies change much, much faster than people. And it is often the case that how we use the different tools depends less on the tools' capabilities, what they do and what they don't do, and more on who we are as a person, who we are as a people, where we live, what is our language, what our history is, etc. So part of the message from this book is to be mindful of, as Mora said, the heterogeneity or the diversity of the platforms, the diversity of the locations of use, the diversity of the media that we have in our lives, but always be mindful of the centrality of the human, that we humans change from era to era, but there is a lot of there's a lot of our core that doesn't change. And in order to better understand how we use the technologies, we need to start with us rather than with the technologies. And that is methodologically, is less a technical challenge than a consciousness challenge or an awareness challenge. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's one way to think about that.
Dr. Mora, the book dedicates a chapter to histories as one of the key pathways for competitive work. Why is it so important to apply a historical lens to social media scholarship? And how can examining past eras help us better conceptualize and access developments in digital culture today?
Yes, that's also a fascinating thing. How so far the majority of social media studies have tended to be sort of ahistorical. With some exceptions, social media research really focuses on the present and assumes that everything that's happening now does not really bear any connection to what happened in the past. And it sort of dehistorizes, removes history out of platforms. So what we do is that we have an entire chapter in which we propose avenues for exploring the genealogies, the histories of platforms. And one of the things that we do is that, for example, we show how many contemporary anxieties around social media and around their impact on, say, mental health can only make sense when placed in historical comparisons, right? For example, current moral panics about platforms as being uniquely, say, addictive or dangerous are often presented as unprecedented, yet very similar fears have accompanied earlier media, from even the novel to the bicycle, like the bike, radio, television, video games. So that's just one example of how understanding how social media are framed these days can be better understood if you look at it from a comparative historical lens. What we also do is that we consider the history of what people have called dead platforms or dying platforms. Because in this sort of present bias state of the field thus far, researchers generally study the platforms that are successful and used at the present moment of writing, and just forget or tend to forget many of the stories of the histories of platforms that were really successful in the past, for example, and died a couple of years ago. For example, as you already mentioned in your introduction, I'm from Argentina, Pablo too. And as a teenager in Argentina around the 2003, 2004, we had a major platform, sort of an early version of a social media platform called Photolog. And Photolog was huge in Argentina. It actually created like urban cultures, people who would use Photologs and were like kind of very, very early celebrities of social media in the early 2000s were completely associated to this platform, which over the years disappeared, right? Like, I don't think it exists anymore. And there are almost no studies about Photolog, because this is a sort of platform that disappeared from our consideration of what counts as contemporary social media ecosystems, right? So one of the claims that we make in the book is we also need to consider the histories of platforms that are no longer here, trying to understand were they similar to platforms that are being used in the present? How was their history of quote failure? What made them a case of success at the time, and what didn't? Right. So all of these cases really bring up really interesting questions and really show us how what counts as novel of platforms is only understood if you look at a much longer pattern in the social production, circulation, and reception of media technologies.
Dr. Mora, you explore how languages, including both textual and non-textual signifiers, serve as a comparative dimension. Can you elaborate on how linguistic and semiotic differences across cultures and platforms affect the meaning and interpretation of social media content?
Yes, for sure. Thank you, Deepak. As histories, as I just developed, the other really important pathway that we look at when trying to make the case for having a comparative epistemological agenda on social media research is what we call, very broadly, languages. And as you said, this includes both textual and non-textual signifiers. And what we want to do here is to focus on meaning itself. And we want to raise attention or bring attention to language as not only just spoken or written words, but also language that has emerged from technological cultures like emoji, likes, hashtags, icons. That's one of the things that we consider. And the other thing that we consider when we think about languages and social media research is that we need to understand that the field has been predominantly serving an English language bias, right? Research tends to consider that English is a sort of lingua franca of the internet, of internet culture. And what we want to do in this chapter is say, okay, not only language is written, because it's also non-written, and also language is not just English. And English is one language, which is of course, important, it's not the only one, right? So what we do is that we bring lots of cases, we develop and we bring new ideas for future research at the time. At the same time, we also analyze research that has already done this. And just to give you one example, right, when we're talking about English as a lingua franca and how that needs to be revised, and how the whole issue of translations on social media, how does it work? What happens when a person moves to a different country? What language does the person use their platform in, right? And one very pop culture example that we bring is that of artist Bad Bunny, right? This is a very important artist in the world, and his native language is, of course, Spanish. And he has used his, not only his songs, of course, his art, but his social media platforms as a site of resistance in terms of using Spanish, right? He's shown consistently an insistence on using Spanish, and Puerto Rican Spanish specifically, challenging the idea, the assumption that English should be the lingua franca that everyone understands on platforms, right? So what we want to call forward are questions about the politics, the power surrounding what are the languages that we see written and read and that we hear on social media, how do translations work, and how also, just to finish this question, and also just to understand how non-textual signifiers are super unstable, and that their reception, their interpretation is really dependent on cultural and institutional context. So that's what we mean when we say we want to bring a linguistic comparative lens to social media research.
Dr. Pablo, the framework aims to enable the study of social media in ways that are global, de-westernized, transmedia, and multi-platform. What does it mean to de-westernize social media scholarship? And why is it this important for building a more accurate and inclusive understanding of digital culture?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's a very important one. Look, there are almost 8 billion people in the planet. Most of them are not in the West. So the very simple answer to your question is that if we don't do that, we are taking a very tiny part for the whole. Right. And for the most part, it's not even so there are lots of inequities in terms of where we focus our research within the West. Right? The West includes many countries, many languages, many cultures. It is often, in the case of social media, right, research on the US from within the US. And the US is a very important country, but it's home to only 4% of the world's population. So why we need a de-westernized and a more diverse, even within the West and outside of the West approach, is so that we can have a realistic picture of how different peoples use the same platforms in different parts of the world. Otherwise, we tend to assume, right, implicitly, that what happens or what applies to one specific location, which is usually a tiny location, applies across the world equally. And that is often not the case, or at least if it is the case, it needs to be explained rather than taken for granted.
Dr. Mora, the final chapter introduces the concept of blurred genres, trading zones, and heterogeneous inquiries. How do these ideas help researchers navigate the intersection of cross-national, cross-media, and cross-platform comparisons, and what new possibilities do they open up for future research?
Yes, that's actually the chapter in which what we try to do is reflect on what comparison can actually do to scholarship itself, and thinking about the fields of communication and media studies more broadly. When you look at the history of the field and how people have analyzed that history in terms of theoretical frameworks, methodological techniques, what you see, and this is something that Professor Silvio Weisword has already developed, is a lot of fragmentation. You see that the field was already born from a very interdisciplinary take on what communication meant. And from that moment on, it continued expanding and really fragmenting its own canon, right? So we don't have one single canon in communication and media studies. We have multiple, and we have very diverse ones. And this has been something that has raised concern across many theorists and methodologists from the field who try to call for a unification of the field and try to sort of grasp with this idea of fragmentation as a problem, right? And what we do is that we sort of take a leap and we avoid, it's not that we avoid, we look at the problem from a different perspective. And what we say is, why don't we take the unifying epistemological principle that to know is to compare, as the title of the book says, in order to not unify, but create dialogue between different theoretical and methodological approaches in the field. And this applies to social media, of course, but it could apply to other objects of study, right? So what we do is that, as you already said, we borrow, concepts from other theorists. We talk about blur genres by Clifford Geertz, trying to understand that, as I was just saying, the boundaries between subfields in communication and media studies and between ways of seeing are already unstable and have been historically blurred. Then we take the notion by Peter Gallison of trading zones, trying to talk about a way in which the epistemological principle of to know is to compare can offer a way for scholars who work in different traditions in methodological and theoretical terms to collaborate around shared problems without erasing their differences. They come together, they exchange, they share mutual understandings without leaving their singularities, right? And without leaving their own identities in methodological and theoretical terms. So what we do is that we claim that having the idea that, the combination of blur genres, trading zones, and really analyzing heterogeneous objects such as social media can help us see how productive knowledge often emerges from partial situated connections rather than total synthesis or total unifications of ways of seeing. And so what we want to show, and this is the last chapter, is that comparison is not a technique. It's, as we see it, an epistemological commitment to explain variation, to resist universalism, and to keep the field open to complexity, right? Rather than closure.
Dr. Pablo and Dr. Mora, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. For researchers and students who want to adopt a comparative approach in their own work, what practical advice would you offer? What theories, methods, and topics do you believe hold the most promise for advancing comparative social media studies in the coming years? First, I would like to request Professor Pablo to share insights, and then I will request also Dr. Mora to share.
So my main piece of advice is to be curious. There is a lot of diversity, heterogeneity, or to use less loaded words. There are a lot of interesting things out there, a lot of interesting phenomena, a lot of interesting processes that fall outside of the stereotypes. So the best place to start is by being surprised at that difference and be curious about what causes it, whether it's one methodology or the other, one theory or the other. That is secondary. The most important thing is to be curious and to understand that the world is full of wonders that are waiting to be discovered and waiting to be explained.
Yes, and that's wonderful, Pablo. And I would just add to that, and this is what we try to do in the book, is to open up the idea of what comparative work means, right? So historically, people tend to associate comparative work to specifically cross-national work, cross-national, cross-cultural, and that's highly important. And it's also very expensive. Because it implies a lot of work and collaboration between researchers from different parts of the world. It requires a lot of translation work. It requires a lot of mutual understandings that are oftentimes difficult to achieve. Now, that's very important, and we need to have more, as we showed in the book, cross-national work. At the same time, I want to invite researchers, and specifically young researchers, to think that comparative work can also be in a different dimension. You can compare across languages, across histories. I mean, you can compare it with a linguistic perspective, with a historical perspective. You can compare across platforms, across media, and also across nations or cultures, right? Even across cultural groups that are smaller at a scale than nations, right? So I would just invite researchers to imagine openly what a comparison might mean in their own research agendas. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Professor Pablo and Dr. Mora, for this thoughtful and enriching conversation. It has been a privilege to learn from your work and perspective on comparative social media research. Thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Deepak. It's been a great pleasure to speak with you and an honor to address your guests.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Deepak. It was a real pleasure and an honor. Thank you.
Thank you.